everyone. Okay, I'm gonna try keep it together and share my screen now. Are you getting that? Awesome. All right. I am pretty nervous, as you guys might be able to hear in my voice. So hopefully as this goes, I'll kind of get into the swing of it. But firstly, I just want to thank Jessamy and the Creative Mornings team so much for putting this together and for inviting me. It's a huge privilege. And I want to thank all of you for coming and being here today. It's like at 9 a.m. on a public holiday in what has been like the craziest week where not even the ground is staying still. And yet somehow you're all here to do this together. And I really appreciate that. So thank you. Okay. So before I begin, I'd like to also acknowledge that I'm speaking to you today from Wurundjeri land. And I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of these lands and waterways. And I pay my respects to their leaders, past, present, and emerging. I'm Alice, hi. And if it wasn't already very obvious from my accent, I'm originally from South Africa. I moved to Melbourne nearly 4 years ago, and I now live and work in Collingwood, where I pay 50 Rand a coffee. Here is a structure so that we can all feel emotionally safe for the next half an hour or so. Over the course of the next 25 minutes, I'm going to be sharing some thoughts on imposter syndrome and how we can reframe it. I don't have an answer, by the way, like you guys didn't pay for a TED talk, but I do have some ideas that I hope might be helpful. I'm going to start by sharing some of my work to give you more context about my own case of imposter syndrome. After that, I'm going to connect this to the idea of a dare. And this link might seem a bit weird at the beginning, but hopefully it'll make sense as I go on. The reason that I'm putting these two separate concepts into conversation is that at their core, they're both about belonging. Imposter syndrome hinges around the fear of not belonging, and a dare is a game that kids play that's essentially about overcoming fear in order to belong. And obviously that can come with a whole host of high-risk behaviors, like Phil and his can of dog food have shown us. But I'm talking more today about the psychology of a dare and using that as a way to playfully nudge ourselves through moments when fear is holding us back. Then for the second half of my talk, I'm going to share 3 examples from my own life when I've dared myself to push past imposter syndrome. It's my hope that in doing so, that I can maybe offer you some ideas for your own life. So I've felt like an imposter for my entire working life. I'm an artist and also a graphic recorder. And this means that I work in 2 very different worlds. Like one day I'll be painting the side of a bridge or in an art gallery. And then the next I'll be in a corporate boardroom helping people visualize their strategy. And sometimes I feel like Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. So my artwork is usually large scale, public experimental poetry and calligraphy. I'm really interested in typography and also the politics of alphabets. All letters carry history with them, and the visual nature of language affects the meaning of the words that we read. I work a lot by hand, but I'm also really interested in the intersection of the analog and the digital language. This is a series of poems I wrote a couple of years back using malware. I got hold of pieces of virus code and rewrote it to make these kind of illuminated manuscripts or murals. And they became these weird in-between texts. Like humans can't read them because it's computer language, and computers can't read them because it's handwritten. And this is the Nelson Mandela Bridge in central Joburg. I covered the wall with a list of the most common online passwords. I can't remember the exact statistics, but something like these 100 most common passwords account for something like 90% of all of the passwords online. And here's what I'm currently working on. I've been creating a font of memories where each letter is drawn from a map of where I grew up. Each sign has a story encoded into it. And it's like a private alphabet that isn't so much about communication as it is about trying to make sense of how we archive and access memory. So As you can tell, my art practice is quite experimental, and I often don't know what I'm doing until I've done it. I usually work with black and white, and I avoid color and pictures. But the other part of my career looks and feels pretty different. I use a lot of color, I use many different fonts, and there are lots of drawings and cartoons. Since I finished uni, I've worked as a freelance illustrator. I started in commercial illustration, but for the past few years, my business has focused specifically on something called scribing or graphic recording. Basically, as people talk, a graphic recorder captures their key points in a picture. The image contains both text and illustrations, and it's more memorable than just taking minutes because people connect with the content emotionally. It's also more engaging because something about humans is we love watching other people draw. I don't know why. It's like staring into a fire. I think it taps into something very ancient in us. So scribing can happen on large sheets of paper, or it can be on a wall. And recently, I've been working fully digitally in Zoom meetings on an iPad Pro, like Sally today. And there are a lot of ways in which these two careers overlap and support each other. This is a picture of all the practice papers that I threw away when I moved here. And none of this work is wasted. Many of the lettering skills translate across the disciplines, but the industries themselves couldn't be more different. I spent years feeling ashamed of this dichotomy, like I'm not fully legitimately one thing or the other. Having a foot in two worlds made me feel like an imposter in both. And I don't know if you've ever felt this way, like different streams of your life feel like they're at odds, or even worse, like they potentially contradict each other or undermine each other. And like you're just waiting to be found out. And that's what I want to talk about today, imposter syndrome and how we can reframe it. Because inconsistency isn't a problem. It can be something expansive. Of course, I still have days that I worry that diversification might be a form of dilution, but that's falling back into a binaristic way of thinking. There aren't clean lines around any of these categories. And it's that kind of thinking that creates the idea of imposters in the first place. It's not a case of either or, it's both and. And this is where the idea of the dare comes in, as a way of approaching imposter syndrome, recognizing that it's totally natural to sometimes feel like we don't belong, but also it's possible for us to be bigger than that feeling. So now that we've spoken a bit about feeling like an imposter, I want to look in more detail at the idea of daring. What do you think of when you hear the word dare? We had some pretty amazing answers at the beginning of this session. I Googled the psychology of dares for this talk. And to be honest, it's usually pretty negative. It's associated with high-risk behavior in teenagers, largely driven by the deep need to belong in the group. But I definitely do not mean this kind of dare. This is a very important caveat. I am not here to advocate for Russian roulette or anything that feels genuinely unsafe. When you see red flags, please run. Today, I'm talking about a different kind of dare, something more playful, an internal dare. It's a game and it can be fun, a gentle nudge you give yourself. It should never be about pressure from the outside. If we're not in any actual danger, that feeling of anxiety that creeps up on us can be a really useful indicator that we're on the brink of doing something interesting, if we choose to accept our own dare. So one of my earliest memories is actually of this kind of internal dare. It was my grandmother's 80th birthday party, and the community hall had been decorated with white roses and bunting, and the gin and tonics were flowing. I was about 6, and I was at the bottom of the garden with my cousins, standing around this deep, dark, algae-filled pond. Just out of our reach was a rock, and sitting on top of it, a huge, slimy frog. My cousins were loudly daring each other to poke it. And because they were a few years older than me, and because I was the only girl, I was not invited to participate. This went on, and none of them would actually do it. They were all too scared. Soon they got bored and wandered off, but I stayed put. I could not take my eyes off that frog. So eventually, even though no one had asked, I did myself, and I did it. I succeeded, and it was glorious. However, in the process, I also fell fully clothed into the pond. I was soaked through, my dress and shoes were ruined, and I wasn't allowed back inside because I both looked and smelled like a swamp creature. But even though I spent the rest of my nan's 80th birthday in the car park, I was shining with pride. I was my own round of applause. Can you remember a time when you dared yourself to do something that felt huge to you, even if it wasn't a big deal to literally anyone else? And do you remember how it felt when you did it? Given that I'm proposing dares as one possible approach to imposter syndrome, it's worth considering the anatomy of a dare. What are its constituent parts? Basically, a dare is a challenge to do something that involves a degree of risk or uncertainty. It's backing yourself and choosing something that might go wrong. And I think these two elements of stakes and choice are really interesting, and they're worth unpacking in more detail. To get a sense of stakes, take as a really simple example the act of walking. Walking along a road is low stakes. You might trip, but at worst, you'll graze your knee. Walking along a bridge is mid stakes, like it's probably okay, but it could go wrong. And walking across a tightrope is high stakes, because there is both the very real chance of things going wrong and also very bad consequences if they do. What's interesting is that the action is the same in each case, walking. But which one is noteworthy? Which would you write a newspaper article about or pay to see? Okay, so this is obviously a very basic example, but I think it demonstrates that higher stakes can make an activity interesting or worthwhile. And if you flip that idea, I think it also shows you that kind of interesting and worthwhile things are probably going to feel more scary. The anxiety is not necessarily a problem. It's just the nature of higher stakes. There we go. And how does choice factor into a dare? So your boss doesn't dare you to submit the expense report by Friday. She tells you to. Or she probably asks you to, but it's a command. And that means that it's not a major source of existential angst because you don't have to think too much about it. You just do it. It's passive. Like it's not your call, so whatever. Choice, on the other hand, means accountability. When we put up our hands and actively opt into something, we also sign up for the responsibility for the outcome. And this can feel both terrifying and exciting. I've just talked about stakes, low and high, and choice, passive and active. And the reason that I'm bringing this up today at Creative Mornings is because when we think about daring, the place where high stakes and high agency overlap, this is also where creativity lives. Let me just slow down here for a moment to ask you, how often do you allow yourself to play in that space? Because by definition, creativity is doing something differently. It's a choice to intervene in the status quo, to try and maybe to fail, and maybe, God forbid, to embarrass yourself along the way. Imposter syndrome is awesome because it means you're playing at the edge of your definitions, rewriting the boundaries of who you are. It doesn't have to be a bad thing. It's just a completely natural side effect of walking out into the unknown. Imposter syndrome is giving you information. It's feedback about stakes and agency, but it is not a diagnosis. Feeling like an imposter is not the same as being one. So we'll check back into our structure. We're at the halfway mark. So we've discussed these ideas in quite an abstract way. And for the second half of this talk, I'm going to share 3 concrete examples of some recent times that I've dared myself to show up. And again, these are just my stories, but I hope that in speaking about them today, they resonate in some way with your life and potentially help offer a new perspective on something that maybe you're feeling stuck with. So, number 1, fucking up in public. Because graphic recording is drawing in front of a live audience, it's like the fear of public speaking combined with writing an exam in front of a crowd on a subject you're only just learning about. And the expectation is to deliver something of value at the end of all that. And I realize this sounds like a nightmare, but somehow it's actually really fun and rewarding. For me, the best part is during the breaks because people come up and chat and take pictures of the graphic as it's unfolding. After 8 years of doing this work, I can tell you that far and away, the most common question a graphic recorder gets asked is, but what if you make a mistake? And I always think that's really funny because the what if implies that there's like a potential version of reality where I might not make a mistake. And it's not a case of if I mess up, it's when I mess up. There are way too many examples to count, but some personal highlights include I spelled the word literacy wrong at a conference of 500 head teachers from all over Victoria. I could literally hear hundreds of red pens all twitching to correct me. I spelled the word success wrong numerous times at a leadership seminar in front of about 40 CEOs. And I stand by that one because one word with 2 C's and 2 S's is just excessive. And when I started, I had no idea what any of the corporate acronyms meant. ROI, KPI, B2B, B2C. None of this came up in art school. The point is, mistakes are a given. If I had freaked out every time something didn't look on the page the way it did in my head, I would have thrown my texters away years ago. Instead, the better question to ask is what's next? Graphic recording as a practice has taught me to work with what emerges in the moment, improvise with mistakes and turn them into something unexpected and sometimes even better. The quicker I let go of what I wanted and meet what's there in front of me, the faster I can move forward. And this principle applies to all creative work and life in general. Fixating on what went wrong yesterday will only make you miss what's happening in the present. And letting go of needing to be perfect is not an inherent personality trait. It's a skill, and we can all practice. Number 2, ask. Okay, so this is one point, but it's kind of a 2-parter. I want to talk about asking on a personal and professional level because they both demonstrate the same principle. So firstly, on a personal note, be the person who asks first. As I mentioned earlier, I moved from South Africa to Australia 4 years ago, and I am really lucky with the people I have in my life now, but it's been a long process. Something I've learned along the way is this. In the beginning, I thought it was hard to make friends because I was new, but actually, it's just hard to make friends as an adult. People who've lived here their entire lives find this difficult too, maybe even more difficult. Over the past few years, I've met many Melburnians who would love to meet new and different people, but just don't know how to go about it. It's not a skill that any of us learn or even talk about, because when you're growing up, your friends are just there. We've practiced how to be friends, but not so much how to find them. There is no shortcut to building relationships. You need to show up, but that's not the full story, because the next bit is even more important, and it's the part that people tend to avoid. It's all well and good to be there, but you have not fully arrived in the room until your voice has been heard. Please don't wait to be asked. Put up your hand, raise a question, start a conversation, get in there. Chat to the person sitting next to you. Stay for the breakout rooms after this talk. And yeah, it's a bit weird in the beginning, but it's worth it. Even now in lockdown, you can still invite a random colleague out for a walk. And I get it. Asking someone to go for a coffee is scary as hell because none of us enjoys feeling rejected. And maybe nothing comes of it. Maybe they don't have space in their life, and that's fine too. But the more you strengthen the muscle of asking first, the more you realize that most people are just as nervous and awkward. I feel terrified like 97% of the time, but I've never regretted being the person who takes a deep breath and dares myself to ask first. The principle carries over into professional life too. Ask for the clients you want. Brene Brown did a speaking tour of Australia in 2019, but when I looked at the ticket prices, it was well above what I could afford. I gave up on the idea until a few days beforehand when it occurred to me that I could potentially find a different way to make it happen. So I Googled the events company who were managing her tour, and I contacted them directly with a short proposal. They were lovely, and a day after asking, I'd booked the job. As you can imagine, I was super excited. But to my disappointment, I arrived on the day to find that I'd been set up at the back of the venue, really far away from the stage. Basically, nobody could see what I was doing, and I was watching the talk through a TV screen anyway. Like, I might as well have just stayed home and watched the Netflix special. At the end of the talk, someone came to collect my graphic recording, and that was that. It was an anticlimax, but at least I'd tried. I packed up my gear, and then just as I was leaving the convention center, out of the corner of my eye, I saw this blonde streak in the distance. It was Brene Brown with her bodyguard, and there was no one else in sight. Half an hour before, there had been 5,000 people in that auditorium. I didn't want to be annoying, so I kept walking. And then it occurred to me, like, her whole deal is about daring greatly. How can I not dare myself to just go say hi? So I turned around and I ran. By the time I caught up with them, they were standing at my graphic recording, and I'm not making that up, and I couldn't have planned it, and I didn't even know where they'd taken the thing. And I told her I'd drawn it, and she gave me the warmest smile and this huge hug, and she said some really encouraging words in that beautiful, thick Texan accent. Somehow it just all came together in this very small, very special moment. This photograph is so meaningful to me, both personally and on a professional level, because it never would have happened if I hadn't kept asking. I think people assume you need to be confident to ask, or even that it's somehow arrogant, but actually it's the opposite. I think asking is a way to show respect and humility. I don't expect someone to know who I am, nor do I expect them to care. Instead, I reach out and ask them. Worst case, they say no, and that's also okay. Other people's boundaries are their own business. The same applies in my art practice. When I first started painting murals, nobody invited me. I literally walked around Woodstock in Cape Town, ringing doorbells, asking people if I could use their walls. Sure, some people said no, but most just flat ignored me. The thing is, you don't need a lot of yeses. You just need one to get started. You can't get the grant or promotion or residency that you didn't apply for. Keep asking. Number 3, show up. Now that we've spoken about asking, I want to finish today by talking very briefly about the flip side of that, about being asked. It's counterintuitive, but this can actually be just as scary. When I was new in Melbourne, CreativeMornings was one of the first events that I attended. This was back in the days of in-person gatherings where we'd all meet for coffee and croissants at the Commons in Collingwood. It felt like this glimpse into what life could be like in this new city. And I've been a Creative Mornings regular ever since. But still, when Jessamy invited me to talk here today, I knew that I had to say no. It was a couple of months ago, and to paint a picture, my husband and I were separating in the beginning of lockdown. I couldn't see any friends, I have no family here, work was unpredictable. Like, to be honest, things just kind of sucked. I was feeling lost and scared, and not at all like someone who should be giving a talk to anyone on anything. But I couldn't be rude to Jessamy and refused like flat out. So to buy some time, I asked her what the theme for this month's talk was. And when she said dare, I was like, damn it, I can't back away from this dare. Like, I just can't. Everything good I've ever done has happened on the other side of a dare. There will never be a perfect time. There will never be a version of you that doesn't worry how other people will receive what you have to offer. But when you show up imperfectly, you give other people permission to do the same. And that is way more interesting than being this magical dancing circus pony who's just out to impress. So here I am, and here you are, and we did this together. So thank you. In closing, I have 3 dares for all of you. Number 1, I dare you to fuck up in public. Number 2, I dare you to ask. People can't help you if they don't know what you need. And number 3, I dare you to show up as you are, honestly and unapologetically, and trust your audience to meet you there. Because the good news is we're all imposters. This is our club, and everyone's invited. Thank you so much, and I hope we have time for some Q&A.